As 2025 flashes by, we find ourselves halfway through the 2020s. Within this half a decade, we saw the completion of a cycle in many ways. For example, a cohort of students started high school this decade and are graduated by now. Meanwhile, another cohort of students began degrees and are finished by now. Another example would be Trump being president again. You know, the same guy we started off this decade with. Also, inflation is, on paper at least, 2% again. But the best example of all, COVID restrictions came and went during this period. Remember when we all had to wear masks and stay home? Yeah, it's now been years since then. Yet, although life has gone back to normal, something still feels off. In fact, this entire decade has felt off. It feels like something went terribly wrong in 2020, and we have been dealing with the ripple effects since then. And when I say something went terribly wrong in 2020, COVID comes to mind, but it's not just COVID itself that threw off this entire decade. It's also the exorbitant wealth transfer that accelerated since then. I'm talking about the K-shaped recovery that has occurred where some people have greatly multiplied their wealth since COVID, while others are a lot worse off. And make no mistake, most people are on the losing end of this K-shaped recovery. There's a difference between people who abused PPP loans during COVID and those who did not. There's a difference between people who shilled meme coins and those who did not. There's a difference between people who locked in a mortgage when interest rates were low and those who did not. There's a difference between people who loaded up on big tech stocks prior to the AI hype and those who did not. There's a difference between people who make enough to outrun the inflation that has occurred and those who do not. And this difference is the age-old difference between the haves and the have-nots, which is more pronounced than ever. But the scariest part of all is that the worst is yet to come. Assuming COVID marked the start of a new era the same way that the 2008 crash or the end of the gold standard marked a new era, that means we are only 5 years into this new era, with several years ahead of us. There is so much further to fall than any of us can comprehend. The world is not going to suddenly make a 180 turn and go back to life before COVID. Instead, all the negative trends that have haunted us for the past few years will only continue. We will only continue to lose purchasing power. Society will only get more geriatric. Decent jobs will only get scarcer. Birth rates will only keep dropping. And so on. Yet, despite how bad everything has become and will become, I see this as more reason to be hopeful than to despair. Let me elaborate. When I say be hopeful, I mean be hopeful in a realistic way that still accounts for the deteriorating environment around us. But rather than give up in the face of unfavorable conditions, we should all strive to make the most of our lives and reach our true potential. In any situation, there are factors that are out of your control and there are factors that are in your control. And you should always strive to make the most of what is in your control. You can't single-handedly solve major societal issues and save everyone, but you can always be doing things to better yourself and be good to those around you. Read books, work out, learn skills, make money. Do anything instead of dreading and saying it's over. As long as you are breathing, you can make some sort of impact. There exists a righteous path, and we should aim to walk that path, no matter our surroundings. And going back to when I said things will only get worse, that's even more reason to be making the most of the time we have now. And I mean right now. This is still the best opportunity we have left to brace for what's to come. So let us all formally accept the 2020s for what it is. Let's accept the fact that there is no going back. Let's acknowledge that we will only continue to live under conditions that are suboptimal compared to previous decades. But let us agree to continue to use the time we have to cultivate the best version of ourselves and to look for the specks of gold that are still out there, because that's the fruitful thing to do. Now, in honor of accepting the 2020s for what it is, let's take some time to reminisce about what's happened so far this decade. Because, as much as I hate to admit this, at some point in the future, we're going to be nostalgic for the 2020s and look back on it fondly like we did with the 90s, 2000s, and somehow even the 2010s. So, I'm going to get a head start on 2020's nostalgia by listing each full year of this decade so far and highlight what personally comes to mind when I think of each year. And for those of you who are still watching, feel free to share in the comments what comes to mind when you think of each respective year. Is there a particular work that came out that defined a certain year for you? Were there any events, whether it be societal or personal, that changed you? Let's compare and contrast. I know it wasn't great for everyone because of, the health crisis and a lot of unemployment, but personally for me, as a high schooler who was living at home, lockdown was absolute bliss. It was the most freedom I ever felt, ironically enough. I was just free to do whatever I wanted, and during that time I watched a lifetime's worth of movies. Like, if I never watch another movie again, that wouldn't be a problem because I have watched plenty at this point. I even started reading physical books again that year, which is a habit that I've kept up since then. I also remember just trying to learn new things here and there. Like, I tried learning skateboarding and graphic design just because I could that year and I had the time to do so. So while the world around me was crashing and burning, I was just chilling out, The weather, it was breezy, and life was easy. And you'd think this time would fly by quickly, yet it felt very slow to me. 1 week felt like a month, and I was able to savor so much of the free time I had back then, which I can't say the same for the free time I have now, which flashes by very fast. What made lockdown so special to me was that it was a time where it was socially acceptable to slack off, which is probably why the free time we all had back then was a lot more valuable. 2021 was like a direct sequel to 2020. The year felt like 2020. Everything that happened just felt like a follow-up to things that already happened in 2020, except by now, it wasn't funny anymore. By then, the restrictions were getting insufferable, and the politics were also getting insufferable, but all things considered, now that I think about it, it was still a relatively easygoing, carefree year of my life. Just not as enjoyable as 2020, since by then, I was getting really desperate for COVID to be over. One of my favorite memories from 2021 was walking through the city at night on Christmas Eve, and just how peaceful and quiet it was. The streets were almost empty, there were barely any cars driving by and barely any people walking out and about, and it was also lightly snowing. Everything just felt so right, and I just never felt more in touch with the universe like I did back then. I also remember Donda came out that year, which was an album I really liked. I also really liked the aesthetics of that era of Kanye a lot. It really resonated with me. It's such a perfect album to listen to at 3 a.m. in the dark when you're alone contemplating life. I mean, just look at the album cover, take a hint, you guys. I recall 2022 being a very exciting and eventful year, both personally and societally. Especially during the first 2 months of that year, I remember during this time the trucker convoy happened here in Canada, and it was really exciting to see unfold in real time because, well, I didn't know Canadians had it in them to do such a thing, but I'm quite glad they did because it helped with the lifting of COVID restrictions. Finally, we could go out and not have to wear masks and social distance again. Another notable event that happened in the first 2 months was the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, I know it really started back in 2014, but you get what I'm saying, right? The war as it is now began back then. And I remember watching a live stream when it began, and the streamer was covering it as it was unfolding in real time. And I knew 2022 was going to be an exciting year just from those two events alone, although not entirely for the best. I also remember this being the year when ChatGPT and other AI tools released. I was relatively early when it came to using AI, like I remember fooling around generating AI images using Midjourney, and the images it turned out were pretty intriguing compared to the AI images now. I feel like 2022 was when the beginning of the end really started to unravel. It's when we were finally allowed to live like pre-COVID times again, except the pre-COVID world no longer exists. 2023 was a pretty quiet year for me. It was like a filler episode. It felt like a pullback from all the activity that happened in 2022. I was keeping to myself more that year, but looking back, I quite appreciate the tranquility of that year, and I wish I made better use of that time, because turns out life won't always be slow and quiet. 2023 was also the year I finally got into anime and manga. I remember blitzing through a lot of big names so I can adequately get a feel for what's the best that this medium can offer. One of my fondest memories of that year was the 1 month I spent reading all of One Piece to date. My phone and social media usage was at an all-time low that month because I was just spending all my free time reading One Piece. And when I finally got caught up with the series, the most recent chapter at the time was chapter 1079, which was an exciting chapter to get caught up on. If you know, you know. I have to say, One Piece is the most ambitious and imaginative work of fiction of our time. If you're someone who is looking to getting into reading books as a hobby, reading manga is a very good way to get started. And if you read all of One Piece to date, you will have read over 100 books, which is a lot of books. I also remember getting into JJK shortly before the second season came out, as well as shortly before the whole lobotomy Kaizen craze. And I gotta say, I could not have chosen a better time to get into the series. I cannot emphasize the cultural chokehold this series had at this point. Never has partaking in brain rot felt so good. You just had to be there. In hindsight, 2023 might objectively be the best year of this decade so far. It certainly was the most tolerable year, and as much as I yearn for 2019 to come back, I think I'd be willing to settle for 2023 coming back as a compromise. 2024 was a more eventful year for me compared to 2023. I did some traveling that year, which I haven't done in a long time, but it was still a solemn year overall, as it became increasingly evident that life will never be the same as it was before COVID. And my life will never be as blissful as it was back in 2020 when this societal shift was still new to us. All that was left was to just put in the work. One notable movie that came out that year that I watched and still think about was Megalopolis. Now I know it's heavily clowned on and it's a very, very easy movie to make fun of, but I quite liked it. I appreciate it for being so drastically different than any other movie being made these days. And to me, Megalopolis marked the beginning of a vibe shift. It signified how bad and unserious everything has gotten, especially under the second Trump administration where everything that has come out of it so far has felt like a scene from Megalopolis. Maybe someday I'll try elaborating on this point. Well, 2025 is still pretty recent. I still don't entirely know what to make of last year. As for things that I remember about last year, let's see. I remember Trudeau finally stepping down, which surprised me because he really seemed like he wanted to go down with the ship, but apparently the rest of his party wasn't keen on losing. I also remember how days before Trump's inauguration that him and his people launched not one but two meme coins because I suppose all the American economy is good for nowadays is rug pulling people. I also remember when Charlie Kirk died last year and then everybody made a huge spectacle about his death, which then led to him being memed everywhere. And now there's probably a whole generation of kids out there who only know him as some guy whose face is plastered everywhere. So the lesson here is to not die until a nuclear war causes a permanent blackout. I also did accumulate a stash of fell for it again memes over the course of last year, which I should probably delete off my phone before I visit the US again. I also watched Eddington last year, which is probably one of the most important movies of this decade. And what makes it great is that it's not just a simple satire about COVID. It goes well beyond that and covers how society tears itself apart, all while the big tech company gets its way. Now that I think about it, if I could summarize 2025, I would say that it was a year comprised of people wanting drastic changes to happen, but not getting any from the top down. It was a year of wanting things to happen, only to be greeted with nothing ever happening. And therefore, to make up for the lack of things happening last year, I predict that several drastic things will start happening this year, if not already. Well, that's all for this decade so far. Congrats to all of you who made it this far, and here's to a fulfilling 2026, no matter what happens.
傾いた夕日が色づ